Thank you all for joining us today. And thanks to my friend Sri for joining us today. We're going to talk to Sri about his entrepreneurial journey and experience. And since it looks like we have enough or a small enough group here, we will kind of open this up after we get a little background here for questions to Sri about that journey and about his experience and any advice and insights he might have for budding entrepreneurs or people who want to work in the entrepreneurial community. So welcome, Sri. Thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely, Pat. It's a pleasure again to chat with you. And thank you for all the support over the years, at T-Rex as well.
We've been friends for a while, Sri, and you were at T-Rex for quite a while, and we're really excited to look at you and your company as a success story in St. Louis. You recently moved into a new home in Maplewood, right? You want to tell us a little bit about that? That's a really exciting development.
Yeah. So it's an interesting story, obviously, because we were at T-Rex, and obviously the pandemic basically made all of us go remote, and we didn't know if people were going to come back to T-Rex, and our team had obviously had grown over the course of that year and the years before that. And this opportunity came along to actually purchase a building that actually had a recording studio on the first floor. So, and I have a passion for music and making music. I figured, hey, this is a great way to actually try to live, two lives, in a way. So that's why we got it. It actually turned out to be I mean, we'll see, the time will tell, actually, but it's really good because it's got enough space for expansion. We can easily seat but 18 people right now on the second floor, and we can expand it to another 18 or 20 on the third floor as well. So we have enough, opportunities to expand that. And yeah, so that was the primary motivating factor behind doing that. For some of it for selfish reasons, of course.
Yeah, yeah. It's exciting. I mean, I just love that Maplewood's such a great place to locate as well. I can't wait to see the space once this pandemic is over.
Or once in the next, hopefully, few weeks or days.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Get those shots in the arm. Hey Sri, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? Obviously, we've talked about you and I have talked about your beginnings in India and so forth. So tell us how did you end up, where did you start, and then how did you end up in St. Louis? A little bit around that.
Okay, I'll try to keep the story. I've got gray hairs to actually show for the long, history I've had. But I grew up in New Delhi, India. Went to engineering school there in a subspecialty of electrical, basically an amalgamation of electrical and computer science. It's a field called instrumentation and control systems. And my dream was to actually, I'm ashamed to say it, my dream was actually to be an astrophysicist or astro engineer, if you will, build rocket ships, type of stuff. And I realized very quickly that I was probably not very good at that. So I ended up coming to US to pursue my business degree, and started my career actually at FedEx, working in their R&D as a project analyst. So this was a mix between technology and finance, which was building out, project justification models and business cases for new investments in R&D for FedEx organization. And I did that for about a little less than 2 years. I actually got a little bit bored there because I felt like I could do more than what an entity that size could offer me at my age. I was, 23 years old at the time. So I ended up working, I got a job at EY, Ernst & Young, and this was in St. Louis, and ended up moving there. And I can see that one of my ex-EY friends is actually on the call. Hey, Marlo, I see you there. Anyway, so ended up meeting people like Marlo there. So did a lot of consulting with EY, traveled pretty much all over the country for a long time. And I had this entrepreneurial bug for a long time. I really wanted to be in business because that was like my passion in some ways, to run a business, but with some technology aspect to it. About 9 years after being at EY and then Capgemini subsequently, I actually left to go for work for a fledgling startup out of Nashville. That was in the healthcare tech space. I actually did not move to Nashville. I just ended up keeping an apartment there and moving and driving back and forth every week. Did that for about 9 years. We grew that company. It was a consulting entity in healthcare tech. Grew that company about 50-fold in the 9-year period. So got a really good first-hand experience of growing a fledgling startup. Um, and about 6 years now, actually, 6 years ago, some of my friends and partners over there had some friends in India who wanted to build an engagement platform for employee engagement, or driving better engagement, because that's a common problem that organizations, big and small, globally face, is driving better employee engagement. And fortunately for me, I had been a consultant, so I'd seen that in many organizations. I'd been a consultant with EY, Capgemini, and then my last startup that I was at called Emits Technologies. Probably been in or seen organizational culture, I would say easily over 100 organizations in different capacities, either as an executive running teams or as a person actually doing the job. And I felt this was a great opportunity because employee engagement is a driving factor behind employee productivity and ultimately better organizational outcomes. And a platform in that area sounded very interesting. And it was a platform really built for employees to connect with each other, a social collaboration for employees to praise each other. So it was very boundaryless platform. So it didn't like have hierarchies in some ways, but anybody could give anybody else direct feedback. Anybody can praise anybody can give anybody else badges, things like that. And that's how the genesis of Engagely came about. And over the years, we continue to build out the platform into a more holistic talent suite, because engagement by itself in isolation doesn't work if it's not tied to overall the management of the people as well, in terms of managing what their aspirations are, working with them on their aspirations, but also tying those aspirations to organizational objectives and organizational goals. So we ended up building a more holistic talent management platform that tied in the employee engagement aspects of uh, the 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 employee lifecycle essentially, but also the performance management, goal setting, and learning and development, because one or the other really doesn't work in the big picture. You can't engage the employee if you don't give them opportunities, and you can't really do any of that if the organizational objectives are not in consonance with the employee's aspirations essentially. So long story short, that's the genesis of how we ended up here, in St. Louis and building Engagedly. So we have a global team. My partners are in India. I started building this pretty much out of my basement, um, in St. Louis. And as we continued to build out the platform, we obviously got some early success. Took us about 9 months to build out the first MVP essentially. And fortunately, the first client was my previous startup, Emits, right? So we were basically modeling after them, and they were already a sizable company. They were at that point they were already over 1,000 employees. When I had joined them, they were like 50, 60, 70 employees. So
Now,
we were,
Sri, what was the name of that company again?
uh,
I'm sorry, I didn't catch it.
yeah, EMIDS, Emits,
Okay.
Emits
Okay.
Technologies. Um, so yeah, they were over 1,000 employees, but by the time we were building a platform for them, when I had left them actually at that point, really. Um, so that became our template in some ways, and it's a consulting company with a global footprint as well. So that was the way we modeled it. And then after that, as we talked to more and more customers and prospects and other HR leaders out there, we learned more about what's essential in a talent management platform, essentially, which, because I don't have an HR background, right? And I mean, I've done performance reviews and I've been part of performance processes and other people processes. So that's long and short of how the genesis of platform is and where we are today now.
So Sri, you were taking, in terms of the development of your platform, you were taking your engineering experience and your development experience and modeling the needs of HR folks who you were working when you had that company that was willing to give you this feedback loop so that you could build a better product over time. Am I stating that correctly?
Yeah, and I've been in management. I was a senior vice president at eMERS previously. I mean, and then prior to that at EY and Capgemini, I was a manager managing project teams. So I had, I had management experience to know what managers and leaders are looking for in a people engagement and a people development and people performance platform to some extent, right? But I was not what I would say academically trained in that area. So I learned a lot from talking to other HR leaders on, because I only know what I know. I did not know what I did not know. So, and that only comes from really talking to people who are actually out there doing it in different ways, and then studying different academic, journals and publications. And also, Aaron, so he was one of our first hires as well. And he's a trained HR professional. So that was obviously helpful to have that on the team.
Right. You said a phrase earlier when you were talking about sort of that entrepreneurial journey. You talked about having this entrepreneurial bug. I'm fascinated with that in the years that I've been working with entrepreneurs. It's pretty clear that there's a drive, pretty clear to me, that there's a drive in people who become entrepreneurs that is only satisfied in pursuing this kind of an effort in building something on their own. Well, how would you define that? What did that feel like to you as you were within, great organizations, but you were feeling something that wasn't being satisfied? Am I stating that correctly, or how would you?
Yes, in some ways, right? I mean, I love Ernst & Young. I think I would recommend anybody coming out of college or looking for some varied experience to work for an organization like EY. What I think was dissatisfying about the job had nothing to do with EY itself. It had to do with the type of work you do as consultants, because you go into an organization, you look at their problem, you talk to their people and the subject matter experts, and you build a product or you help them solve a problem or a process or whatever that is, and then you walk away. You actually never get to see the fruits of your work. In many cases, some of these projects get shelved because they didn't execute on it properly at the end of the day, or maybe they just didn't see the business value at the end of the day. And those were actually kind of disheartening to some extent, even though you really had no stake in the outcome per se. So that was kind of dissatisfying. So then when you work with them, you can also see sometimes, and you're constrained by the client's own thinking. Sometimes this won't work, but you're like, I think this could work, and we should at least try, right? But there's a lot of that constrained thinking, especially in larger organizations. And I've always had a very much of a risk-taking mindset. So that I think is hard to do in a large organizations. Not all, obviously. Some organizations like Google, Amazon, and Tesla are built on the DNA, but not necessarily all the other Fortune 500s are. So that was probably the primary force behind me wanting to go and do something on my own, at least partner with people who have a similar mindset. And having that itch scratched is probably the best way to describe it. Yeah, I don't know if I can, I say this aloud, I don't know if I can go back to working for a corporation of some sort, regardless of how much monetary incentive there is.
Yeah. I think that, this is about you, but I will say that I sort of have the same feeling sometimes. Here at T-Rex, I have a lot of freedom to take risks with the board that I have and with our team, and we're able to try things and do things. And if they work, it's great. And if they don't, we move on. And I love that flexibility. And I think it would be difficult to go into a more structured experience, especially at this stage of my life. So I don't know if that's how you feel, if that's echoing how you feel now.
I think I don't have a problem with structure necessarily. I have a problem with
Yeah, structure is probably the wrong word. I'm sorry,
corporate
but go
politics,
ahead.
right? Corporate politics is probably a big one. Uh, Building empires, people hoard employees and hoard talent and not sharing them across departments, across other managers. Um, those things really bother me, or bothered me. And I'm sure it bothers a lot of people. It's not something that is very unique to me.
Sure. Yeah.
So those things are, and I remember, and I actually had this a story. This is a true story. I won't name the company for what it's
Sure.
worth. It's a big telecom, huge telecom. Okay, so I'll give you that. It's a huge telecom, one of the largest in the U.S., if not the world. So I was a consultant. This was back in when broadband was just being launched, and I was brought in as part of a team to help them transform being a parts, which is plain old telephone system. I don't know if anybody knows what parts is. My age shows. So anyway, parts is your dial-up phone, right? Your phone rings, you pick up, and that's parts. And they wanted to move from parts to a broadband, which is DSL at that point, which still is DSL for many companies. And we had to rewrite all their processes to sell this completely new service that didn't exist, right? And I used to sit in these meetings, and these long meetings where they're trying to make decisions, and we would be in meetings of 20, 25 people, people who are, obviously experts in their field. Some of them are billing experts, some of them are experts in the technology of telephony, some of them are just business people. And after I'd be like glazing over, because this is a 15-minute discussion. We are taking an hour and a half, and we still haven't decided. We decided when to have the next meeting to have this meeting. And I remember looking out the window, and this building, I know the building I'm talking about. This is a very, very tall building in downtown. I used to sit in, probably on the 17th or 20th floor, or whatever the floor was, out of the window. I'm like, damn, man, I wish I could just jump out of this window and just fly away right now. So I'd be looking at the window, and mentally visualizing just breaking through the window and flying away.
Flying.
So that kind of experience, I think, was obviously, I remember that specific one because I basically was daydreaming about it in the meeting. But that's, if you're having those kind of feelings, you're probably trying to look for something that's more challenging.
Yeah, yeah. It's so true. Now, so taking that feeling and moving to the next step, and you said that you're a person who isn't afraid of taking risks, but I mean, there must have been some moments when you worried whether, it's a big jump to leave the security of a big organization and all of those relationships and try something new. I mean, how was that jump? Did it feel scary, worrisome? What was the thing that made you take that leap? The final thing, maybe.
I think I had a similar feeling 10 years prior to that, almost 10 years prior to that. When I decided to leave EY and Capgemini and go to another startup, which was also a fairly big risk. Not huge risk, because even though I did take a pay cut, but I became a partner as part of the process because I was like, I'm invested in this. So obviously I've been through that once. And I thought of that as a risk, but I'll tell you, this is a very, this one sits very vividly with me, actually, this story, and I'll try to keep it short.
You're
This
okay.
was on the day of 9/11. I was doing a project for Walt Disney World. We were building a brand new reservation system for Walt Disney World, or we were proposing to build one that integrated all their hotels, air, and cruise and theme parks. And it was a pretty complicated system that they were trying to build. And I was one of the consultants on the project. And obviously Disney World shut down when the plane hit. They evacuated the park. I was stuck in Orlando. I was staying at the Marriott there. So I'm just stuck there with no way to get back to St. Louis. And that's when it dawned on me, because what was interesting is I was so caught up in that work at that day, and that I didn't actually pay much attention to the planes being, hitting the towers, because there was a lot of chaos going on in the Disney headquarters there. I was in the headquarters within the park, which you don't know about because they are hidden behind bushes. So So obviously, we are in this bubble within the park, and that evening it dawned on me that I was not paying attention to any of it because I was so into, on this project. And I realized that I should probably be looking at what really makes me happy, because I could have been on the tower, right? And
Yeah.
that day, I think I decided I want to do something different. I want to do something
Mm.
that, instead of working for just running this, hamster wheel where you're working Monday through Friday, you know, in a city, and in a different city, because consulting is all about traveling and coming back home and then doing it again next week and the week again next week. Before you know it, you have hair like me. So um, that I think that was kind of the motivation behind it, and that's when I decided I wanted to go and do something different. And
Mm-hmm.
it took me another 4 or 5 years to actually quit. But my first risk I took after that was really start making movies. And I mean, you know that.
Yeah.
So I started taking courses in community college on how to write scripts, um, and I started reading people online and started making movies on our weekends, and ended up, obviously, which a lot of people don't know, or know, some of I've made like 7 feature films over the years.
Mhm.
Those are big risks, because you're really betting everything on it, and you're doing it. You're basically working 2 jobs, because you're doing that job, and then on the weekends you're doing this, and then you're taking all your vacation time and working 12-hour days to make movies. Um, so your vacation is actually a lot more work, and you're exhausted by the time you get back to work, and then you're on the plane again. So it trains you to be an entrepreneur at that point. So that was
Yeah.
the first motivation to do that. And obviously I was lucky in some ways, because they were really good. The leadership at Emirates is really strong, and we were able to really work together as partners and grow that entity. And I just realized that one of my clients is actually on the call, Laura. Hey, Laura. So Laura actually is one of Emirates clients, which I didn't know about, because they're a healthcare tech firm as well. Um, so anyway, um, that so I went through a journey. It was successful. So obviously they gave me more confidence, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
By the
Mm-hmm.
way, when I did leave Emirates, I thought about what I want to do next. If I wanted to
Yeah.
start my own thing, or should I go back to consulting, or just take some time off and do nothing for a while? And I did interview with a couple of other big five, because that was like the natural thing that came to me, to maybe go back to consulting again. And I interviewed, I won't name the big five. It's not EY, but it's from a different one, and no fault of their own, actually. And I realized what the role would be. It was a role for a partner, which is a good
Mm-hmm.
role on paper, but it's a lot of stress. It
Yeah.
ages at twice the speed. And after interviewing there, I realized I just couldn't see myself doing it, and I
Mm-hmm.
dropped out, I dropped out of the interview process. I was like, I can't do this. So I decided I want to do
Yeah.
something, and then this
Yeah.
opportunity. So I basically didn't have any options, really, to be honest. It's not like I had many options. I don't want to be unhappy.
Well, I mean, part of it is self-discovery through that journey, right? I mean, you start to know what makes you happy and what makes your life meaningful, at least to you and the people around you. So that's what I notice in a lot of very successful entrepreneurs. So
Thank you.
yeah, I mean, Sri, you've had an interesting side story. You got to know Florence Henderson really well in your movie making, and she was wonderful with you, wasn't she? You guys got to be really good friends.
Yeah, it's so sad we lost her, a year after we
Yeah.
made the film. But her son lives in St. Louis, and I still hang out with him once in a while. Well, I haven't hung out with him much since the pandemic started. But yeah, so that was an awesome experience.
Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was her
Yeah.
last film. Her last film was our movie.
It's so cool. What's that movie? So people can look it up. Can they
Oh,
still see it?
well, it's called Bad Grandmas. It's a dark comedy with, you know, mature ladies who decide to take law into their own hands.
Awesome. I love it. And I
Yeah.
love Florence Henderson too. I was a big fan. So Sri, okay, so how is it? I'm always so curious about how you have locations for Engagedly. obviously your partners are in India, so you have a workforce in India, you have partners in India, you have an office in Australia, office in St. Louis. How do you make all that work? It sounds so complicated to me.
Oh man, okay. So yeah, we have a sales office in London, Australia.
Oh, in London. I forgot about that. Sorry.
And we just opened one in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia as well. And obviously we have a big presence in Bangalore, India as well. Well, I've always been, not always, since consulting, a lot of the technology consulting has a offshore component to it. So I'm used to working with offshore teams. The key, I think, to work with different team members and teams is a clear definition of responsibility, to have clear definition of what they're working on. And that's one of the things that Engagedly does well. The product too is setting good goals, it's setting goals, clear defined goals with defined outcomes, and then making sure that everybody knows what they're supposed to do. And then what you're really doing is not micromanaging them. What you're working on is how can I help you achieve your goals? What do you need from me? Right? And then so the discussion is really about their objective and what struggles they have in overcoming some of the obstacles that are impeding them from achieving their goals. And then what other creative ways we can think about to overcome that, but also look at different ways to drive that goal forward, right? So if you have structured conversation around that, that's basically how I have looked at working with teams. And the other thing is, this is a interesting thing where I was reading this. I did a lot of intercultural studies in my management culture studies in my grad school, where they were talking about how some of the management for example, in the US Army is different than some of the other armies. Is that when a US, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is what I studied, and one of our sales leaders is actually an ex-Marine Corps as well, is when a US Army team or an infantry unit or whatever the unit is loses a leader, somebody else takes the leadership and runs with it. They're not waiting around for somebody radio back to get instructions. They make the decisions based on the situation they have, based on the guidelines they've been trained on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because your plan just went out of the window. Whatever your plan was, you lost
Right.
your plan went out of the window, and now you have to execute on that out. You have an outcome that you have, but you don't have a plan anymore. You got to replan that for that. And I think that type of approach with your team members too, right? Because now you're sitting in the UK or India or wherever, you have a team that you empower them to make decisions. You make sure that you're hiring the right people who are enabled to do that, because they're not waiting around to be told, hey, what I should do, because you're 12 hours apart, 14 hours apart, and sometimes even if you have a few hours together, it's not enough to have that collaborative discussions. So that, I think, is an approach in terms of how you hire and how you coach and the culture you build within the organization, that is empowering to them, that they can make decisions without a fear of a repercussion if they make the wrong decision. It's fine if they make the wrong decision. In fact, I tell people, if you're not making decisions and failing sometimes, that means you're not taking enough risks. And what you're doing is you're waiting for somebody to tell you what to do. And that doesn't work in an organization that is globally distributed, and especially in a startup sense.
Do you notice, you're gonna see me moving something here because I didn't plug in my laptop before I started this, and now my battery's running low. Do you notice any cultural kind of differences across the various countries that you're working in terms of attitudes about failure? I mean, it feels like in the US I think we're getting better, but we're so afraid of failing that often that can, sort of freeze people up in terms of taking action. So it's just an observation. But do you notice any cultural differences in how people look at failure across the various places that you're looking at? Are those learning experiences? Are those to be avoided at all costs, or what do you notice?
Well, I think the fear of failure is to some extent cultural, but to some extent, I think the psychological profile of the individual themselves. There are people who don't have any fear of failure and they can completely go maverick and go rogue on you. And you don't want that either, because there's a certain framework in which they should probably function, right? Culturally, I think I would say in general, the US is probably better positioned in that way, which is why we are such a highly productive and entrepreneurial society. I mean, I'm seeing more and more of that in countries like India as well. And in some other Northern European countries, we see a lot of that as well. So I think we see that more over, I would say, in the US and Northern Europe, probably more than anywhere else.
You see what, the fear of failure or the
a risk-taking ability.
risk-taking? Okay, well, it's good.
Yeah, but I definitely see, because when you're in the US, it looks like people are not taking enough. But if you start looking at other countries, it's probably even worse in some cases, right? So that I think is, but I will say this: it can be something that you can be trained out of. If you have the right leadership, because leadership really, culture really starts at the leadership. If a culture of an organization is good or bad, like I said, this telecom example versus a Tesla example or an Amazon example, Jeff Bezos actually encourages failure. At least that's what he says. I don't know how much of it is true or not, but they're both American companies. It's a question of how you build the culture, and the culture really starts at the top. Are you actually rewarding people and encouraging people to take risks, or are you actually stifling the ability to take risks because you are going to look bad to the leadership as a manager, or or to the shareholders, or whoever that is? And then the world is moving so fast. You have to be able to do that, because you cannot rely on the top management to always be the one making decisions, because first of all, they don't have enough time, and necessarily they have enough knowledge of what the ground realities are in some cases, right?
Right. Yeah. Sri, we're going to check for for questions here. I haven't. I know there's a few chats, but one of the things that I wanted to ask you is if probably several of our folks in this call are interested in their own entrepreneurial journeys, and so if for newly minted entrepreneurs or people who are considering starting their own businesses, what kind of advice would you give to people, or do you give to people in thinking about that?
I do have just one question that I always frame everything with when I take a risk, right? This was like the question I asked myself when I made my first film, where I basically went bankrupt in the process. I mean, I didn't technically go bankrupt, but I was basically like in, I don't know, $60,000-$70,000 in credit card debt, which is pretty bad place to be for a 25-year-old. But anyway, so I think the question to ask yourself is, what is the worst that can happen?
Yeah.
What is the worst that can happen, right? So, and we should be all lucky, that we are in a country like US, which has plenty of opportunities, where the worst that can happen if you take that, it won't work out and you have to go back to another job, potentially, right? Or maybe you bet everything on it and lose your house. You can file for bankruptcy. The laws protect you from that. And I think it's fine. So what? You still have food to eat. You can't, I don't think you'll end up on the streets, because if you are risky enough to take and entrepreneurially enough to take risks, you will figure out a way not to be able to end up on the street. So that if you ask that question and just go through the scenario and play that scenario and that decision tree in your head, and think about all the possible outcomes. Obviously, there's a list of possible positive outcomes, and there's a list of possible negative outcomes, and there's extremes on both sides. On one side, you can become Jeff Bezos, on the other side, you can become Looney Tunes and on a street, begging for your next meal. obviously that at that point you got to question your own psychological profile and say, okay, maybe I need some therapy here. But if so, assuming that extreme is out, the worst that can happen is not that bad. It's really not, right? You failed, maybe you learned something from it, and you go back to your normal world of going back to your corporate job or whatever else that you were doing before that. And then maybe get to take a shot again. And I did all of this while I was married and had a kid as well. So it's obviously those are considerations to take into aspect as well. But I think even if you took that into consideration, I think it's still an exercise to go through. And maybe some people can accept that worst possible outcome, and some people can't. And that's why not everybody can be an entrepreneur, right? Or wants to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, it's true. I always told my husband, well, I learned how to make a great cup of espresso. If anything ever happens, I can be a great barista.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's always something to do, right?
Well, but you have a PhD, so you can always go back to teaching. So
yeah, that's true. Yep, yep. Well, we have a few minutes left, I think, unless Tyler, you think we're done or no, but I'd love to see if there's anybody out there who has any questions for Sri.
I do. This is Marlo Valdiabella. Srikant, my friend, how are you?
I'm good. Been a very long time.
I couldn't miss this. When this came across my email that you were presenting at Venture Cafe, I said, I've got to work my schedule to make this happen. And unfortunately, I was not live for the first 20 minutes because I was actually picking up my kids from school and they were screaming in the van. So couldn't engage at that time.
I still remember our discussions on short pants.
Oh, you know what? I just looked up online. There's 4 websites that are focused on men with short pants companies that do that. So someone took my idea and just ran with it.
We talked about the idea like 25 years ago, right?
We did. It was literally way back when. And just want to tell you, I'm a huge fan of Srikant. I'm, admire sort of your journey that you've taken. Remember the days at E&Y where we were just working the circuit. I too was in a bunch of those DSL broadband meetings at that one telecom company that not to be named. So been along that journey, and just to see you take your dreams and just making it happen, from the filmmaking, which by the way, Srikant makes a mean wedding video. He videoed our wedding and did such a fantastic job. And just where you're at today, my friend. I wish we could hang out more. Maybe this is the catalyst for that. Maybe when the pandemic is over, we're gonna go to happy hour. We're gonna hang out. But congratulations, my friend, on everything that you've done, what you've accomplished. Great stuff.
All right. Thanks, Marlo. Thanks. We should definitely hang out again when.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Not only are we having a great talk with Sri, but we're reuniting old friends. How about that? So cool. Sri, what final question for you? What do you think that the St. Louis ecosystem could do better in terms of supporting entrepreneurs? Any ideas there?
Oh, I have several ideas. I think the biggest thing the ecosystem could do is, because there's a lot of established companies here, I think the biggest thing they can do is them having some kind of an incubator or not even necessarily incubator, but a mechanism where they would fund some of these startups either through actual cash or say, hey, we will do a pilot with your product. Build your product, or if you already built your product, let's do a pilot in one department or one division or whatever, and let's prove it out. And if you do a pilot and it works, and let's say a company at Anheuser-Busch or Monsanto or any of those, there's dozens of those in St. Louis that maybe even not that big. There are smaller ones too, right? I think that would be a great way to start building out at least the initial state. And I say this because the reason Silicon Valley is because when a company gets started up and gets funded by VCs, there are hundreds of VCs there. the first thing they do is they sell to each other.
Yeah.
And then what happens is eventually, within the first 6 months, they've already got like 50 customers, which is extremely hard for a company in St. Louis to match, a startup in St. Louis to match. Because every customer you're trying to get, you're really hustling for each one of them. In a way, it's good because you're really proving your product out to some extent, but also when you get the kind of trajectory, the growth trajectory that you can get is just completely unbalanced, because of that. So I think that's probably the biggest thing I would say. And there's a lot more money there. I mean, that you can't beat that. There's a lot more funding for startups there. I think that's obviously something that can be done better. So I guess that's my two big things. I mean, if I was talking purely from a government-private partnership, I think I would like to see a more progressive government in Missouri that would have a fund for startups, even if it is ideally focused on minorities, to be honest. I think definitely they have an even less of a opportunity in that sense, purely because of their network is not as strong and as resourceful as the people who are doing startups coming out of WashU or coming out of your Laddu High School connections and whatnot.
Yeah.
I think some of the partnerships between, for example, the Arch Grants and TDEX working with state and county government or city government, I think could be done to give a boost.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, having those customers locally and having some of the bigger companies take a chance on and pilot some of these things that smaller companies are developing would be a really great opportunity to advance entrepreneurial activity in the region. You and I have talked about that. It's a need for sure. We did get a question from Laura. She says, I'm interested in what kind of culture you've created at Engagedly. What's important to you when you hire leaders, and what do you envision for the future of Engagedly?
Okay, so for transparency, Laura is a client of ours, just so everybody knows. But the culture at Engagedly is still evolving, to be honest. I think one of the core values that we focus on, or a couple of them that I'm really out of the 5 core values, is extreme ownership, where you own the outcome and you're not pointing fingers. So even if it is not necessarily your domain and you have dependencies on other teams, what can you do to solve the problem? Don't wait for the phone to ring, call them up and say, hey, I was expecting this from you. Why haven't I gotten this? And really hold them accountable and raise that. So that extreme ownership, because you're still owning the outcome in some ways and grabbing the horse by the reins, essentially. So extreme ownership is a big value that I cherish, and I try to instill that with all the people I work with, and at all levels. It's not just about the managers and the executives, but at every level. The second one is a learning mindset. The learning mindset is extremely critical, especially if you are in an industry like ours, where and I think the same goes for Sapphire Digital as well, which is where Laura is in a rapidly evolving area, lots of competition, and there's there's always things changing. And if you have people stuck in doing things the old way, you're gonna suffer as an organization. So a learning mindset is something, and I think it can all be coached or trained into to some extent. I don't think people are born, maybe to some extent, people are born with a learning DNA or a DNA for extreme ownership, but I think those things can be instilled within the organization.
I hadn't heard that term before, extreme ownership. That's an interesting term, but I really like that.
Yeah, I listened to a TED talk by a Navy SEAL, Jocko Willink. I don't know if you heard of Jocko Willink. Some of you may have heard of Jocko Willink. He has a really good TED talk on it, and then he wrote a book about it. And now he has his own consulting firm that trains people on this.
Okay.
I encourage people to watch his TED talk if you are if you want to learn more about that whole process. He talks about this whole incident in Iraq where his team was over there and how they took, they had a friendly fire and actually ended up hurting one of their own people. And that's how he came up with this whole concept.
Yeah, yeah. Well, anybody else got any questions for our wonderful guest here? Sure.
Yeah, Sri, I was wondering, you've taken on a lot of different challenges, and an entrepreneurial is never one that kind of rests. So what's your next big challenge, whether with it's Engagedly or, something else maybe in the music industry, since you got a passion for that?
Well, the music only came about because there was nothing else to do in the evening. I started playing drums, and we have a band, and we are actually in the recording studio about 3 to 4 times a week in the evenings, trying to record our first album. So that's actually fairly challenging because it's something I've never done before. I, in fact, didn't even know how to play the drums until 3 years ago. But I would say that's a challenge. But in terms of the bigger picture, I think Engagedly I think I have, big ideas and aspirations for Engagedly. And, we really want to build this platform to something that actually a win-win for both organizations and their people. Because until both of them win, you don't really have true success. You basically have people who are there who are punching a clock, and we really want to provide a culture, or at least enable that culture with our platform. We can't change the culture, but we can at least enable it, where we can provide that level of fulfillment for people coming into work, where it's a win-win for both. And I think the more we can do that, the more innovations there are. I mean, there's so many more innovations we can do. I can't see us stopping for another 4 or 5 years, at least, at the minimum.
Well, Sri, thanks so much, my friend. It's just wonderful to talk with you as always. You've been such a good friend to us here at T-Rex, and a good friend of mine. And I know that will continue, and we just wish you the best success, and are so proud of everything that you're doing. So thank you, Sri.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
See you, Sri. Take care, buddy.
See you guys.